Hello, class. How's everybody doing today? Hope you're all having a good day, and if not, hopefully this lesson will make it a little bit better. So today, before I go over the lesson, I just want to let you all know to pay attention, a little extra attention while I'm speaking. Take some notes because next class that we meet, we'll be having a discussion about what we've learned today. Okay, so a little introduction. So today we're going to be learning about the court case Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So just a little background information before we actually start talking about this case. So first of all, in order to understand this case, we need to understand first the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case that was ruled in 1896 that it was constitutional that white people and people of color had to go to separate public facilities, but the Supreme Court ruled that these facilities would be equal. So if you ever heard the term separate but equal, this is where that term came from. So pretty much they said that, they split up white people and colored people, and they had, different bathrooms, different movie theaters, different schools. So, yeah, so they were supposed to be equal, but I mean, today we know that they were not equal. And back then, they could also tell that things weren't equal between the white and the colored. Okay. So let's talk about who was involved in this specific case, Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. So people involved, Linda Brown and her father, Oliver Brown, and also the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. So Oliver Brown is the father of Linda Brown, who and her father is the one who filed for the case. So we'll be getting on to that just in a little bit. So we're going to go on to the next slide. So what happened? Okay, so Linda Brown was denied admission to the school that was closest to her. And Oliver Brown, her father, felt that he and his daughter were being discriminated against, so he took the school board to court. So next slide. So when did this happen? So this happened around the year 1952. A decision was reached in 1954, but we're not there yet. Keep explaining. So we've heard of who, what, when, so where, Topeka, Kansas, like I said, and why. So this is where we're going to start getting into a little bit more. So because of Plessy versus Ferguson, Linda Brown, who was an African-American girl, she was required to go to a colored school. That's why, because of this old court rule in Plessy versus Ferguson, that's why she was denied admission, because she was a young lady of color. And her father, he felt that they were being discriminated against, and he felt that it was unfair for his daughter because the white school, which was the closest to her, which was in her district, denied her entry because she was African American, just because she was African American. So because of that, she was required to go to a school that was miles farther from her house than this school, which was a lot closer to her. So that's why Mr. Brown, Oliver Brown, felt that this wasn't fair, and that's why he decided to file this court case. So why did he do this? Why does it matter? Because in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, it states that all Americans have the right to equal protection. So under this, Oliver Brown, after consulting with his whoever took on his case, which members of the members of the NAACP, but we won't get into that specifically. But their argument was that this was a violation of the 14th Amendment because this was an extension of it, because they said that they were not getting they don't have the right to an equal education. They didn't, like their education wasn't equal to what the white people and the white schools had. So let's talk about a little about the schools. So the colored schools were, they were run down. They were in neighborhoods that weren't as wealthy. They didn't have as much money. A lot of these kids weren't as privileged as the white kids, their white counterparts, and therefore they had less opportunities. Field trips, events, things like that. There wasn't as much funds for these colored schools as there were for white schools. So they were at a disadvantage. And also, some of the materials, actually most of the materials they had were secondhand books, used books that the white schools weren't using anymore. They were all old books. None of it was new material. They also had too many students, sometimes not enough desks to fit the students in the classrooms. And also many times students had to share materials, books, things like that. And there were also not enough teachers for all of these students to teach all of these students. So that was another big problem in the colored schools that the white schools necessarily didn't have to deal with. So before I tell you, what the outcome of this court ruling is, I want you guys to think about, write down what you think will happen, and why do you think it will happen. So just pause the video, and I'll give you, take a second to jot down your ideas and what you think is going to happen. Okay, so the next slide. So the outcome. So at first, the federal district court, they dismissed Oliver Brown's case, because they said that these segregated public schools were equal enough, and that the colored schools were getting close enough to the same education as the white schools, which we know, like I said, we know now, and they knew back then that it wasn't. They weren't getting the same type of education. It wasn't equal. Like I said, that colored schools were at a bigger disadvantage than the white schools. So they decided to take this case to the Supreme Court, and they did. And on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court reached a unanimous decision, and which means everybody on the Supreme Court, they voted to end segregated schools and overrule Plessy versus Ferguson. So this meant that there were no longer going to be segregated schools. There was no longer going to be a white school and a colored school. It would be integrated, and there would just be one school for all students. So, this is huge, because this really, this isn't this. Some places this happened, but this was for the whole country. This was for everybody. So this required all states, all cities, that all schools were to be integrated. So this is huge. It's something that, like I said, never happened before. Okay, so for next time, I want you guys, when we have our discussion, I want you guys to talk about what you've learned. How is this important? And who is important to, and who did it impact the most? Okay, so think about this in terms of the history of the United States, and from what your prior knowledge that you have, what's happened in our history. And I want you guys to think about how this affects some of the things that happened in the near future in our history. Some of you may know, some of you may not, but when we get back to class, we'll have time to discuss this, and we'll see what you guys come up with. And here we just have some additional links to some websites that if you guys want to look up more on this topic, that you can for more information. That way you're a little bit more informed when we come to class and discuss this next time. So that's it. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you've learned something today. Well, I know we have, but I hope that we can have a good discussion about this the next class time we meet.